Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. I wasn't supposed to hear that conversation. If I had left my purse on the dining room chair instead of the kitchen counter, I might still believe my children saw me as their mother instead of a problem that needed solving. I was 72 years old when everything changed. That Sunday evening had started like dozens before it. My son Daniel had invited me over for dinner. His wife Lauren had made roast chicken, and my daughter Rebecca brought a pecan pie from a bakery across town. The house smelled warm and welcoming. The grandchildren were laughing in the backyard. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that life was settling into something peaceful, after all the losses I had endured. Since my husband passed away 4 years earlier, family dinners had become the brightest spots in my calendar. They reminded me that I still belong somewhere. Dinner ended around 8 o'clock. We cleared the table together. Rebecca hugged me goodbye. Daniel walked me to the front door. I had already stepped onto the porch when I realized I had forgotten my purse. "I'll grab it," I called. "Be right back." Nobody answered. I walked quietly through the hallway toward the kitchen. Their voices drifted from the breakfast nook around the corner. First, I wasn't paying attention. Then I heard my name. I stopped, not because I meant to listen, because something in Daniel's voice made me freeze. "Mom won't be able to stay in that house forever," he said. The words landed heavily in my chest. Lauren answered softly, "I know. We need to figure something out before there's an emergency." Rebecca sighed. "The house is too much for her. The stairs alone worry me." I should have walked away. I should have made noise and announced myself. Instead, I stood there holding my breath. "The real question," Lauren continued, "is what happens with the property. Property. Not home. Not Mom's house. Property." The word felt cold, clinical, like they were discussing an investment instead of the place where I had spent 43 years of my life. Daniel lowered his voice, but I still heard him. "We need a plan. If we wait too long, it'll only get harder." Rebecca agreed. "She won't like it, but eventually she'll understand." Understand what? I wanted to walk into that room and ask the question. Instead, I stood motionless beside the hallway wall. Every family photograph hanging there suddenly seemed different. Every smiling face looked unfamiliar. For years, I had believed my children saw me as independent, capable, and strong. Yet here they were discussing my future as though I wasn't part of the decision. As though my opinions were obstacles to overcome. I quietly retrieved my purse from the kitchen counter. Nobody noticed me. Nobody knew I had heard a single word. I left through the front door without saying goodbye. The drive home took 22 minutes. I remember because I watched every minute pass on the dashboard clock. The radio stayed off. The roads were empty. And somewhere between Daniel's neighborhood and my own driveway, a terrible realization settled over me. The conversation itself had hurt. But what frightened me most was the possibility that this discussion hadn't started tonight. Maybe it had been happening for months. Maybe longer. As I pulled into my garage and turned off the engine, I sat in complete silence. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering what my children needed from me. I was wondering what they were planning for me. The next morning, I woke up at 6:15, the same time I had for nearly 30 years. Habit is a stubborn thing. Even after retirement, even after losing my husband, my body still believed there was somewhere important to be. The house was quiet. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen curtains and stretched across the hardwood floor. I filled the kettle, made my coffee, and stood by the window watching a pair of cardinals hop across the backyard fence. Usually that view brought me comfort. That morning it only gave me space to think. I kept hearing the same words. Property. Plan. Eventually she will understand. They repeated in my mind like a song I could not turn off. By noon I had convinced myself. I was overreacting. Daniel had always been practical. Rebecca worried about everyone. Maybe they were simply concerned. Maybe any family would have the same conversation. I wanted that explanation to be true. I needed it to be true. But once doubt enters a room, it rarely leaves quietly. Over the next few days, I began noticing things that once seemed harmless. Rebecca called Tuesday afternoon. After asking about my health, she casually brought up the house. Had I thought about downsizing? Was I still comfortable maintaining such a large property? Did I ever consider moving closer to family? The questions arrived one after another, wrapped in concern. Before that dinner, I would have answered without a second thought. This time I listened carefully. On Thursday, Daniel stopped by to replace a porch light. While we worked outside, he mentioned that several homes in the neighborhood had recently sold for impressive prices. He even estimated what mine might be worth. I smiled and thanked him for helping with the light. Inside, another piece clicked into place. Then there was Lauren. Looking back, she had become unusually interested in my finances over the past year. Nothing direct. Nothing obvious. Small comments. Casual questions. Suggestions about simplifying things. At the time, I appreciated her attention. Now I wondered whether I had mistaken curiosity for kindness. One evening, I opened a drawer in my home office and found a stack of old photographs. There was one of Daniel at age 10 holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. Another showed Rebecca in a school play wearing a paper crown I had spent hours making. I sat there for a long time studying those pictures. They reminded me of years spent driving to practices, helping with homework, working overtime, and stretching every dollar so my children could have opportunities one never did. I was not counting sacrifices. Parents do not keep score. But I could not ignore the growing distance between those memories and the people my children had become. The hardest part was not anger. It was uncertainty. I still did not know what they were planning. I only knew there was a conversation happening without me. A conversation about my future. And for the first time since my husband died, I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent years trusting that my children would always include me in important decisions. Now I was beginning to wonder if they had already made one without me. The following Saturday, Daniel invited everyone to his house for a family barbecue. The weather was perfect for early summer. The sky was clear, the temperature hovered around 78 degrees, and the smell of charcoal drifted across the backyard. From the outside, everything looked normal. Children chased each other through the grass. Neighbors waved from across the fence. Lauren carried plates from the kitchen to the patio with her usual bright smile. If someone had taken a photograph that afternoon, they would have seen a happy family. I almost believed it myself. Almost. Since that dinner a few weeks earlier, I had started paying attention in a way I never had before. Not suspiciously. Quietly. Carefully. The difference was remarkable. Rebecca arrived carrying a bowl of pasta salad. Within 20 minutes, she asked whether I had renewed my homeowner's insurance yet. Daniel later mentioned how difficult it must be to keep up with repairs on a house my size. Lauren talked about a lovely retirement community she had read about online. None of the comments were rude. None sounded cruel. Yet together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. I spent most of the afternoon listening instead of talking. That was when I noticed something else. Every conversation about my future happened in front of me but never included me. People discussed possibilities. People shared concerns. People proposed solutions. But nobody asked what I wanted. Late in the afternoon, I went inside to refill my glass of iced tea. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard voices coming from Daniel's home office. The door was not completely closed. I recognized Lauren's voice first. The sooner she moves somewhere smaller, the easier this will be for everyone. My hand tightened around the glass. Rebecca answered, "I know. But if we push too hard, she will resist." There was a brief silence. Then, Lauren spoke again. "We have to think long term. That house is worth a fortune. Maintaining it is not realistic." Fortune. There it was again. Not memories. Not family history. Value. Numbers. Assets. I stood there for only a few seconds before walking away. I did not want to hear more. Somehow hearing less felt worse. My imagination filled the gaps. I returned to the backyard and sat quietly beneath the shade of a maple tree. Around me, life continued as usual. Daniel laughed at a joke. The grandchildren played catch. Lauren brought out dessert. Nobody seemed aware that my entire understanding of the family was shifting beneath my feet. Driving home that evening, I thought about my husband. He had always been able to read people better than I could. He noticed motives. He paid attention to details. I trusted too easily. Perhaps I always had. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, One truth became impossible to deny. Whatever plans my children were discussing had not appeared overnight. They had been thinking about my future for a long time. The only person who had not known about those conversations was me. For several days after the barbecue, I found myself looking at my life through a different lens. Nothing around me had changed, yet everything felt different. The house was the same. The garden was the same. The photographs lining the hallway were the same. But the certainty I once carried was gone. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork in my home office, I opened a filing cabinet I had not touched in years. Inside were folders containing tax records, insurance documents, mortgage statements from decades earlier, and handwritten notes my husband had left behind. I sat on the floor surrounded by papers as sunlight streamed through the window. What began as simple organizing slowly became something else. Memory after memory surfaced. I remembered when my husband and I bought the house. We were young, nervous, and stretching every dollar we had. The roof leaked during our first winter. The furnace failed twice. We painted every room ourselves because we could not afford contractors. Daniel took his first steps in the living room. Rebecca learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Every corner of that property carried a piece of our family's story. To others, it might have looked like valuable real estate. To me, it was a lifetime. As I sorted through the documents, I discovered a yellow envelope tucked inside an old file. My husband's handwriting covered the front. Seeing it stopped me cold. He had always written neatly, every letter precise and deliberate. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. Most of it contained practical notes about finances and household matters. Then I reached a paragraph that caught my attention. He wrote that no matter what happened, I should never allow anyone to make important decisions for me simply because they believed they knew better. Reading those words felt strangely timely. My husband had always respected my judgment. Even when we disagreed, he treated me as an equal partner. 4 years after his passing, I had assumed my children would do the same. That assumption no longer felt safe. The following evening, Rebecca called. Her voice sounded cheerful. She asked how I was feeling and whether I needed help with anything around the house. Then, almost casually, she mentioned a retirement community that had recently opened about 20 miles away. According to her, it offered wonderful amenities, organized activities, transportation services, and maintenance-free living. I listened quietly. When she finished, I simply thanked her for the information. There was a brief pause. I sensed she expected more. Perhaps she expected interest. Perhaps agreement. Instead, I changed the subject. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The conversation itself had been polite, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time, I stopped trying to convince myself that these were isolated comments. Too many pieces now pointed in the same direction. My children were planning for a future they believed was best for me. The problem was that nobody had asked whether it was the future I wanted. The following week, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped defending myself against concerns nobody had voiced directly. I stopped volunteering information about my health, my finances, and my plans. For years, whenever my children asked questions, I answered immediately. It felt natural. Families shared things. Families trusted one another. But now I wanted to understand what was happening before I revealed any more of my own thoughts. The silence changed everything. Daniel called one evening and asked whether I had scheduled the roof inspection I mentioned months earlier. I told him I was handling it. Rebecca asked if I needed help reviewing some paperwork. I thanked her and said I had it under control. Neither conversation lasted very long. For the first time, I noticed how many of our recent discussions revolved around managing parts of my life, rather than simply sharing it. One Thursday afternoon, I met my friend Grace Miller for lunch at a small diner we had visited for years. Grace was 68, sharp-minded, and impossible to fool. We ordered sandwiches and sat near the window overlooking Main Street. After a while, she looked at me and said, "Something is bothering you." I laughed softly because she was right. Without mentioning every detail, I told her about the conversations I had overheard, and the growing feeling that decisions were being discussed behind my back. Grace listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stirred her coffee and sat quietly for a moment. "Margaret," she finally said, "sometimes people convince themselves they are helping when they are really taking control." Her words stayed with me long after lunch ended. That evening I walked through my house room by room. The guest bedroom. The family room. The sunroom my husband loved during autumn afternoons. Every space carried memories, but I realized something important. The house was not the source of my strength. The life I built inside it was. If I ever chose to leave someday, that decision would be mine. Not because someone else had decided it was time. A few days later, I received an unexpected email from a financial institution regarding an account my husband and I had maintained for many years. It reminded me of several investments I had not reviewed recently. Curious, I gathered my records and spent an entire afternoon examining everything carefully. The more I reviewed, the more I realized how little my children actually knew about my financial situation. They seemed to view me as vulnerable, dependent, and overwhelmed. The truth was very different. My bills were paid. My savings were healthy. My investments remained stable. I was not struggling. I was simply living quietly. As the evening sun faded beyond the backyard trees, I closed the final folder and sat back in my chair. For weeks I had focused on what my children might be planning. Now another thought entered my mind. Perhaps the bigger question was not what they intended to do. Perhaps the bigger question was why they had become so certain that I could no longer decide things for myself. The following Monday, I made an appointment with the attorney who had helped my husband and me organize our estate years earlier. His office sat in a quiet brick building near downtown, unchanged from the last time I visited. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. As I sat there, I realized I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Not because I had answers, but because I was finally taking action instead of simply wondering. When Mr. Harrison greeted me, he seemed genuinely pleased to see me. We spent a few minutes catching up before turning to business. I explained that I wanted to review everything. My estate documents. My accounts. My property records. Nothing dramatic. Just a complete review. He nodded and began pulling files from a cabinet. For nearly 2 hours we went through every detail. Some documents I remembered clearly. Others had not crossed my mind in years. What surprised me was not what I learned about my finances. It was what I learned about myself. For so long I had allowed others to make assumptions about my situation. Even I had started accepting some of those assumptions. Yet the numbers told a different story. My mortgage had been paid off for years. My investments remained healthy. Several accounts had performed better than expected. My monthly expenses were comfortably covered. By every practical measure I was doing well. At one point Mr. Harrison looked up from a folder and smiled. "Margaret, you are in a much stronger position than many people half your age." I laughed softly, but his words stayed with me. Stronger position. Nobody in my family spoke about me that way anymore. Somewhere along the line, concern had replaced confidence. Capability had been replaced by caution. Independence had been replaced by assumptions. Before I left, I asked several questions about future planning. Not because I intended to make immediate changes, but because I wanted to understand every option available to me. Mr. Harrison answered each question carefully. By the end of the meeting, I walked out carrying a folder filled with updated information, and something else I had not felt in a long time. Certainty. On the drive home, I stopped at a small park overlooking the river. I sat on a bench watching the water move slowly beneath the afternoon sun. Families walked along the path. Cyclists passed by. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked happily. Life continued as it always had. The difference was inside me. For weeks, I had viewed myself through the eyes of my children. I had worried about what they thought, what they planned, and what they expected. Sitting there beside the river, I finally understood something important. Their perception of me was not the same as reality. They saw someone fragile. Someone approaching the end of her independence. Someone who needed guidance. But the woman sitting on that bench was not helpless. She was not confused. She was not waiting for someone else to decide what came next. As I watched the sunlight dance across the water, I realized that whatever conversation my children had been having, they were missing a crucial piece of information. They were talking about a version of me that no longer existed. About 2 weeks after my meeting with Mr. Harrison, Daniel called and invited me to dinner. There was something unusual about his tone. It was friendly but deliberate. The kind of voice people use when they have already rehearsed part of the conversation in their minds. I accepted the invitation. By then, I had stopped avoiding difficult truths. If anything, I was becoming curious. When I arrived that evening, everyone was already there. Rebecca sat at the dining table sorting through photographs from a recent family trip. Lauren was setting out dishes in the kitchen. The atmosphere felt almost too pleasant. During dinner, conversation stayed light. We talked about the grandchildren, local events, and summer travel plans. Nobody mentioned houses. Nobody mentioned retirement communities. Nobody mentioned my future. The silence itself felt intentional. Then, after dessert, Daniel cleared his throat and glanced toward Rebecca. It was a small gesture, but I noticed it immediately. Rebecca nodded. Lauren folded her hands together. Suddenly I understood. This was the conversation they had been building toward. "Mom," Daniel began carefully, "there is something we wanted to talk with you about." I set my coffee cup down and smiled. "Of course." He exchanged another glance with Rebecca before continuing. "We have been thinking about how to make things easier for you over the next few years." Easier. There was that word again. Always wrapped in concern. Always presented as kindness. Rebecca leaned forward. "We just want to make sure you have support if you ever need it," Lauren added. "And we want to help before any problems arise." I listened quietly. They explained that maintaining a large home could become stressful. They mentioned stairs, repairs, yard work, and unexpected expenses. Then they began discussing alternatives. Smaller homes, retirement communities, assisted living options if necessary someday. Every suggestion sounded reasonable when considered individually. That was what made the conversation so complicated. Nobody was being cruel. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody said anything openly disrespectful. Yet through it all, one thing became impossible to ignore. They were presenting solutions to a problem I had never said I had. Eventually, Daniel looked at me expectantly. "What do you think?" The room became very quiet. For a moment, I simply looked at my children. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. Just observation. I saw concern in their faces. But I also saw certainty. They had already decided what was best. They were not asking for guidance. They were asking for agreement. A few months earlier, I probably would have given it to them. I might have reassured them. I might have promised to consider every suggestion. But something had changed inside me. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly. "But I am doing very well." Rebecca opened her mouth as if to respond, then stopped. Daniel shifted in his chair. Lauren smiled politely, though her expression tightened slightly. For the next few minutes, the conversation moved on. Yet I could feel the surprise around the table. They had expected cooperation. What they encountered instead was confidence. And as I drove home beneath the glow of streetlights that evening, I realized that for the first time since this entire situation began, I was no longer reacting to their plans. I was beginning to shape my own. Over the next several weeks, I became intentional about something I had neglected for far too long. I began making plans based on what I wanted instead of what other people expected. Started with small decisions. I joined a local travel group for retirees. I signed up for a weekly art class at the community center. I even booked a short trip to a coastal town I had always wanted to visit but never found time to see. None of these choices were dramatic. Yet each one reminded me that my life was still my own. Around that same time, I met with Mr. Harrison again. This meeting felt different from the first. The purpose was not to review my finances. It was to update several documents and ensure that my wishes were clearly recorded. We discussed future healthcare decisions, property arrangements, and long-term plans. Everything was straightforward. Everything reflected choices I had made for myself. As I left his office, I felt lighter than I had in years. Meanwhile, my children continued checking in regularly. Their concern remained constant. Rebecca sent articles about senior living communities. Daniel occasionally mentioned home maintenance costs. Lauren recommended programs and services she believed would make life easier. I listened politely. I thanked them for their suggestions. But I no longer felt pressured to justify my decisions. One Sunday afternoon, the family gathered at my house for lunch. The grandchildren played board games in the living room, while the adults sat around the dining table. At some point, the conversation drifted toward future planning again. Daniel brought up retirement communities. Rebecca mentioned how nice it would be if I lived closer to them. Lauren spoke about convenience and peace of mind. This time I let them finish. Every word, every concern, every carefully prepared argument. When the room finally became quiet, I folded my hands and smiled. I appreciate that you all care about me, I said. But I need you to understand something. They looked at me expectantly. I have reviewed my finances. I have reviewed my plans. I have met with my attorney. And I am exactly where I want to be. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted several seconds. Not because anyone was upset. Because they had not expected that answer. I continued calmly. If the day comes when I need help, I will ask for it. If I decide to move, it will be because I choose to. Until then, I am living the life I worked hard to build. Rebecca lowered her eyes toward the table. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Lauren offered a small nod. For the first time, nobody tried to persuade me otherwise. As the afternoon continued, the atmosphere slowly relaxed. The conversation shifted to other topics. The grandchildren laughed from the next room. Sunlight filled the house. And while everything looked the same from the outside, I knew something important had changed. The future was no longer being discussed around me. It was being defined by me. Several months have passed since that afternoon when I stood in a hallway and accidentally learned something my children never intended for me to hear. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had never returned for my purse. Perhaps life would have continued exactly as before. Perhaps I would have remained unaware of the conversations taking place around me. Perhaps I would have slowly allowed other people to shape decisions that belong to me. I will never know. What I do know is that the unexpected truth changed me in ways I could not have imagined. The months that followed were not filled with arguments or dramatic confrontations. They were filled with clarity. I continued taking art classes every Thursday. I traveled with my new group and visited places I had postponed seeing for years. I spent more time with friends. I planted flowers in the garden my husband and I once tended together. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my life through the expectations of others. Something interesting happened along the way. As I became more confident, my relationships with my children actually improved. Not immediately. First, there was uncertainty. They were accustomed to offering advice and having me seriously consider every suggestion. Now they were seeing a different version of me. A woman who listened respectfully but made her own decisions. Over time they adjusted. So did I. Daniel still checked in regularly. Rebecca still worried about me from time to time. Lauren still offered recommendations she thought might help. The difference was that everyone finally understood where the boundaries were. Concern was welcome. Control was not. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after everything began, the entire family gathered at my house for Thanksgiving. The dining room was full. The grandchildren had grown taller. The kitchen was crowded with food and conversation. At one point, I stood near the window watching everyone laugh together. For a moment, I felt the presence of my husband in the memories surrounding me. Not sadness. Gratitude. He had always believed that strength was not about winning arguments. It was about knowing who you are when life tests you. Standing there, I realized that the greatest gift hidden inside that painful discovery had nothing to do with money, property, or future plans. It was the reminder that my voice still mattered. My choices still mattered. My life still belonged to me. I do not believe my children intended to hurt me. I think they convinced themselves they were helping. Sometimes love becomes tangled with assumptions. Sometimes concern quietly turns into control. The important thing is recognizing the difference before it is too late. Today I still live in the same house. Still wake up early. I still drink coffee by the kitchen window and watch the birds in the backyard. From the outside, very little has changed. Yet everything is different. Because now, every morning when I look around the home I spent decades building, I feel something stronger than comfort. I feel ownership of my future. And that, more than anything else, is what the truth finally gave me. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.